My name is Asif Zaidi. I work as a senior advisor to the Post-Conflict and Disaster Manager branch of UN Environment based in Geneva. By nationality, I am Pakistani. My first degree is in medicine, and I have been trained in management and environmental studies in UK universities as well as American universities. I have been working in my present position for the last 13 years as operations manager first, and then as senior advisor. I have backstopped programs and projects in various countries in African and Asian continent, including Sudan, South Sudan, Haiti, Afghanistan, Nepal, Nigeria. In my previous life, I worked in Afghanistan for 4.5 years as the UNEP's representative to Afghanistan. Before that, I have done 3 years in Iran, 6 months in Tajikistan, and quite a number of years in Pakistan, my home country.
Hi, and I'm Carl Bruch. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Welcome to our 4th live office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'll serve as facilitator and offer questions as appropriate. Today we'll be answering a mix of questions, some that were submitted by students ahead of today's session, and some that we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to get through all of them. If we don't, we encourage you to post your questions in the office hours and in other discussion groups. And with that, maybe Asif, we could start with a little bit more about your work in the field. Maybe you could provide students with an idea of the sorts of projects that you've worked on, maybe focusing on one that you are most proud of or one that was the most challenging that you learned the most from.
Well, the most difficult part of my professional life with United Nations has been in Afghanistan. I went there in April 2004 to head the UN Environment Office there. And this is in the immediate aftermath of the new government coming in after Taliban were removed from the government there, and the transitional government was formed. And the country has seen physical destruction, but also a complete destruction of institutions over the period of nearly 30 years of civil war. And the most important element of my life was in Afghanistan when I look back and see the institution that I helped create in the form of National Environmental Protection Agency. The war has its own impact on physical infrastructure, but it also decimates the institutions that care for environment and that also prevent conflict over natural resources. In Afghanistan, those institutions at the village level, at the city level, at the provincial, at the federal level were completely destroyed. And the environment institution was not an exception. So we created, with the help of government of Afghanistan, with their request, a very small unit in the Ministry of Energy and Water. It turned into a branch, and then it turned into an independent National Environmental Protection Agency with 600 people spread over 34 provinces. And I remember the days when we sat and created the organogram, wrote the job descriptions, interviewed people for the top positions, and one by one included them in the structure of the ministry. And then today, when I look back, I see that ministry fully functional, not compared to a developed country or even a developing country Ministry of Environment, but yes, for a post-conflict country, something that one should be proud of. I had my role in that as one of the lead architects on behalf of the UN Environment, and I'm very, very proud of that.
Asif, I'm curious. One of the things that I've seen in a number of countries is that it often takes a long time to affect the changes, and the expectations of donors are much more aggressive timelines, short timelines. What you described there sounded like it was a longer process. I guess the first question would be, how long do these things take? And secondly, how do you do this sort of reconstruction given the 1 year, 2 year timelines that there often are for projects?
Yes. When I started working with the donors and government of Afghanistan, I told them that work of the United Nations, particularly United Nations Environment Program, will not be a short sprint. It will be a long haul. And keep your mind on a 12 to 15 years duration, not less than that. Institutions are not built in a 3 year time frame that the donors want the project to be. And this has been my advice to all the countries that I have named where I have worked, which have just come out of conflict after signing peace agreements between the warring parties. The institutions take 12 to 15 years, and donors have to consider that fact. We were lucky in Afghanistan that first of all, the European Union came in, and also that the philosophy at that point in time in Afghanistan was to build the country rather than to end the conflict, which is currently the predominant theory. At that time, it was to build the country. And building the country meant creating new institutions, building capacity of individuals as well. And donor after donor came in addition to European Union, DFID came in, Jeff came in, and we rolled over projects after projects. And since 2004, we are there, still there, combining funds from a number of donors. They appear projects, but they're really programmed. They roll into a long-term thinking where UN should leave, at least UN Environment should leave by giving the responsibilities to the national authorities. So the time horizon has always been long there, and so far donors have supported that outlook, particularly our environment.
I'm wondering if you could also comment on the time horizon for changing culture of. I'm not talking about the local culture, but often there's a certain way of surviving during conflict that you don't necessarily rely on the laws or the institutions. It's much more resolution through force. You build the institution, you develop the laws and the regulations, you do the training, but how do you kind of build that culture of compliance where they follow the laws or implement the laws?
Yes. I mean, in countries, and I can compare two countries, Afghanistan and Sudan. In Afghanistan, 3 million people migrated to Pakistan. They moved to Pakistan, and 1 million to Iran during the Soviet occupation and lived there. So the new generation in Pakistan and Iran became multicultural. They learned English language. They got computer skills while their country was occupied and having an infight. When they returned, there was and still is competition between the older and the newer generation. The older generation has been trained on the top-down model inherited from Eastern Europe and from Soviet Union, where dogmatic decision-making takes place and there is top-down approach. The new people who came in brought a very different philosophy and a different language skills, different and more democratic approach as well. And they helped us in transitioning from the previous model to the new model. No doubt there was tremendous resistance, and there is still tremendous resistance. Sudan had different thing. In Darfur, despite the history of war since 50s, large-scale migration out of the country did not take place. The universities still kept working. So the culture in Sudan remained viable for initiatives that could quickly get into substantive results. In Afghanistan, the achieving results was much more difficult than Sudan for that reason. The other learning that I had in Afghanistan and now in Sudan as well is that when you create projects and programs in your offices, you don't create European or US culture, you create local culture. So our office in Afghanistan, dominated by gradually more and more Afghan nationals, initially dominated by international staff, but gradually become predominantly Afghan. The culture was Afghan, language was Afghan. We hired 2 translators right from the beginning in our office. Everything was translated so that it reaches the lowest level of the government in their own language. So the cultural phenomena that you point out is extremely important, and that is true for Sudan as well. Less difficult in South Sudan because it denounced its Arab culture and opted to English. So it's a different challenge there. But in Sudan and Afghanistan, culture as a tool towards indigenizing development extremely important.
We just had a couple of questions on Afghanistan. Maybe take those before moving on to more general questions. The first one, and I'm not certain if this is something that the UN Environment is involved with, or if this is something that's part of the broader rebuilding package. Are there any plans in investing on education, or rather schools in Afghanistan, and promoting school attendance in order to keep children and the youths occupied?
Okay, the mandate within the UN system on education belongs to another institution, which is UNICEF and to some extent UNESCO. So, in all countries where I worked or I'm still working, UN Environment doesn't touch directly upon education, whether it is primary, secondary, or tertiary. But I can tell you that for environment itself, when you enter into a country after the conflict has subsided, it is important to engage the universities, regardless of which country, whether you are in Darfur or whether you are in Kandahar in Afghanistan, right from the beginning, because UN will leave one day, international NGOs will leave one day. But if you create appropriate human resources, they will be the one who will replace you. So we are heavily engaged with Kabul University, which has a very long history of engagement with European institutions, particularly German universities, long history. We are also involved with a university in Central Highlands in Bamiyan. Same is true about the two universities, one in Darfur, Al-Fasher University, and one in Khartoum University. By the way, Khartoum University was a premier university 40 years ago in the Arab world. They lost that pride for a number of reasons, including the civil war, but the revival is taking place. And one of the ways to do this revival is to engage them on environmental education. And that means working on the curriculum, working on archives, working on biodiversity in terms of sampling and preserving samples of both plants as well as seeds. Those are the kind of things that we do with universities. Scientific work and related to museum as well.
And I think the point that you make is really important. That that you have a number of agencies with different competences, and secondly, that you're then coordinating. There are linkages, but also that there are other agencies have primary responsibility for certain tasks. The second question is, do you find some relationship between the impulse of the large copper mining by a Chinese company and the liquidation of the pistachio trees to make charcoal as a coping strategy?
Okay, the two phenomena are independent of each other. Let me first touch upon copper mine. The copper mine is just 30 kilometers outside Kabul in a neighboring province. After a long process, the government gave the contract to Chinese company. It has got into lots of problems. One major problem was the lawlessness in that area. This is eastern Afghanistan, bordering Pakistan. A lot of initial Taliban infiltration in that area, and subsequently these days it is the Islamic State that has infiltrated that particular province. The mining sector needs a lot of energy, and they did not have enough energy. So right from the beginning, there was challenge to find solutions for energy. A lot of water is needed, so solutions to have enough water. Then when they started digging, the archaeological sites were discovered and some were destroyed, a lot of hue and cry. And the current mode seems to me, and this is my personal opinion, the current mode seems to be that the company that got the contract will hold it for a long period of time without doing any substantial work till the things become peaceful. Now, in this province, which is called Dengarhar, just on its eastern boundary, the pistachio forested area starts and makes an arc, starting from southeast right up to north and goes up to northwest. This is pistachio belt, and it has many parts of it has survived. There are huge new projects coming in to have reforestation in that area. The lawlessness is less so in north and northwest, more so in southwest and southeast and south, and this has resulted in a phenomena where timber crosses the border to both Pakistan and Iran, and it serves for the benefit of the insurgency. So there are groups. The distinction between the anti-government elements and the criminal elements and smuggling is barely visible. They do all kinds of things. So this timber passes its way across the border, feeds the market in Pakistan and Iran, and provides monetary support, financial support to the insurgency in more than one way. I mean, there are other ways to have this thriving insurgency in that area, but one of the means is forestry resources.
I'd like to come back to the discussion we were having a little bit ago about rebuilding governance. One of the questions that somebody asked beforehand was, how do you set up new or resurrect old ways of natural resource dispute resolution? Maybe you could share an example when a country or community was particularly innovative in the systematic design of conflict resolution. If not, is there a model or theory that you know of that has yet to be implemented but holds lots of promise for dispute resolution?
I would say that this question is the question that social sciences faces in countries like Afghanistan. How does this happen? And I can give you a few practical examples of how it was destroyed and how it is being resurrected. Now, the Afghan society has been tribal for thousands of years, and the tribes in the villages, in the agriculture system, have had in their own inherent mechanisms to take care of natural resources. We cannot glorify these traditional mechanisms by calling them as full of justice and egalitarianism. No, we cannot. They have been dominated by the elite of the village, of the tribe, but they had some semblance of structures that took good care of the resources, whether they were forest, whether they were grazing land, whether it was water. They took good care of that. And this system had worked for hundreds and hundreds of years without any major issue, with small population and large resources. Things change for two reasons. One is that when you have a country, cities of which were occupied by a foreign force, and the villages were occupied, particularly at night, by the mujahideen, who had arms and ammunition, the dynamics of the villages changed. No longer the natural resources were being taken care by the village elders, by the committees of the village elders. This all transformed. The person who had the gun had the control of natural resources, and they decimated whatever monetary benefit they could get from it. And this is a story that you can see in all parts of Afghanistan, where the gun resulted in a new rule, power emanating from the gun. It all started changing from few areas in Afghanistan where a rural support program was started. And for the first time, Afghanistan saw the seeds of something that has already been experimented in, for instance, Nepal, in, for instance, India and Pakistan, what is now called community mobilization and creation of community organizations. So Afghanistan, for the first time, 2005, 2006 onwards, saw creation of VDCs, Village Development Committees. These were very different from the traditional structure that they had, which was dominated by the village elders and the elite. The new structures were egalitarian to some extent, and they were controlled by the villagers, and that they had membership of at least 75% of the villagers. This transformed the nature of development. So we saw the seeds of from the ashes of the destroyed structures, community structures, new structures emerging, which were more democratic in nature, fragile, not having for a very long period of time any legal persona because they were informal, but already talk starting about giving them a legal persona. Eventually, if you talk about 25, 30 years of horizon, we may see the seeds of local government in them, that they will transform themselves, what appears in other developed countries or neighboring developing countries as formal institutions that will have elections every few years, elect their own leader, and receive resources from the revenue of the provincial or state government. So community institutions have been transforming in this manner. The other transformation is the ministerial changes that have been taking place. Now, Ministry of Environment was an anomaly for Afghanistan in the sense that when other South Asian and Central Asian countries were creating their environmental institutions, Afghanistan was occupied. It never created its environmental institutions. They started creating it when the transitional government came in, and it found its own way in the sense that it saw that it will have never resources equivalent to American EPA. It will never have those kind of budgets, those kind of personnel. So it created its own institution, which was small, only regulatory, not having any line agency functions. And that means a new generation of institution was taking place in Afghanistan. This was the institutional change that was happening in the ministerial form.
I remember UN Environment had a really interesting project some years ago to help resolve disputes between the agrarian and pastoral communities. And that had there's an interesting approach to much more of the people-to-people and at least initially not engaging as much with the elites because they were manipulating their populaces, or at least this was the thought, that they were manipulating the conflict for political gain. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Possibly the best example I could give is Darfur, where I have provided backstopping and technical support for the last 12, 13 years. Darfur is the size of geographic size of France. It's such a large area, having conflict for the last 30 years plus. And if you say conflict, people would ask which conflict. So there is a conflict between the central government and the people of Darfur. There is conflict between the Arab tribes and the African tribes. There is conflict between the Arab tribes, and there is conflict among the African tribes. There is conflict within Darfur, different parts of Darfur. So which conflict are you referring to? And the breakdown that happened, again, similar to Afghanistan, is that in previous history, Darfur had tribal mechanisms where tribes will have chiefs, they would negotiate, they will have yearly passage of pastoralists, which agricultural land would be used, which will not be used, which animals will pass through which pass, how much water points will be given to this tribe and that tribe. This was all resolved at the tribal level. The creation of nation states had the desire to create new institutions, but it didn't create in time. It destroyed first the old institutions, but it didn't replace it with appropriate institutions. So Darfur had a completely destroyed tribal mechanism, and it hasn't able to replace it. What our project did, and it's a purely institutional development project, is that it created mechanisms to have dialogue among different parts of the government, people, and themselves. around natural resources, which are relatively neutral areas of negotiations. The central government, because of its nature, doesn't allow organizations like UN to intervene in non-neutral subjects like human rights and others, but it looks positively at institutions which touch upon natural resources, agriculture, and others. And we managed to create an environment where the center would speak to the states in Darfur on integrated water resource management. Learning from South Africa, we took several study groups, ministerial people, farmers, pastoralists to South Africa to see how it works. We started dialogue between host communities in Darfur and the communities that have found their way, leaving their land out of the force exerted by the Arab Janjaweeds. Both Arabs, or both Africans, or sometimes Arab, the other Africans, not talking terms. Hundreds and thousands of people living in the camps and having negative relationship with the host communities. And we started dialogue on water issues, like how much water you can use with from the boreholes that UNICEF has dug. How will you use the grazing land? These are the points on which integration started happening. How will the river that runs in Darfur, seasonal river, how could that be trained to have more arable land? How could that be distributed? How grazing land could be given to a certain tribe and not to. These are all issues that are in social sciences are soft issues. They are not hard technical issues related to technology and seeds and water, but they created the right kind of environment to increase the size of the pie. So if you work together on upstream, downstream, seasonal river, they found out that they have more water to distribute among them. They found out that they have more grazing land. They found out, and one of the anecdotal evidence, and we now have a study monitoring system to measure this, but the anecdotal account is that the valley in which we are working, which is called Wadi Al Ku Valley, the police have reported that over the last few years where the project is being implemented, there are few registration of violent conflict cases, fewer registration of competition cases arising out of competition registered at the police. This is anecdotal evidence, and we are trying to develop better tools to measure this. How, when you do good natural resources development with the community, it results in stabilization of a certain area with positive impacts on their income, on their relationship, as well as creation of new institutions.
I would also note that we have a case study on Wadi El Ku in Module 4, so people will have a chance to become more familiar with that. And there are some additional videos that were being shared from that experience. Asif just received another question back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is an Islamic state with Sharia laws. And the person is asking, are there any new discourses in sensitizing locals on the importance of the role of women in general? Any positive progress, any negatives? And I don't know if you want to address that in the context of environment and land, or if you're familiar with other broader efforts.
Yes, let's take the example of laws prevailing on land or on water in a given area in Afghanistan at any given point in time, even now. So if there is a dispute in a given area, three sets of law could be used, either one or all three of them, depending on the advantages that the conflicting parties or the competing parties may have. So there is a customary law, which is unwritten, but hundreds of thousands of years old, which has set the rules. And people can resolve it amongst themselves with the village elders amongst themselves, and the customary law allows you, for instance, which month of the year animals will be allowed to go out of their homes into the grazing area. There is a date in the customary law on which part of the spring month they will go out. Before that, it is not allowed. So one is customary law. The other is Islamic law. That also has its own rules, regulations. For that, you have to go to the mullah who will interpret it, maybe rightly, maybe incorrectly, and maybe to the advantage of one party or the other party, or maybe different interpretation made by different scholars. And the third is the statutory law, which the government of Afghanistan has come up. And at a given point in time, all three laws would be would be applicable. And this is one of the problems that we have in terms of land ownership and water rights, what will be followed. And this is the work that that you will see happening in most of the countries. Even in Sudan, Darfur, land ownership is a problem. There are hereditary and customary rights, and there is statutory, and then there is Islamic, and you fight along with that. But the debate is like what Europe was a few hundred years ago. It transformed its laws over the period of time by removing the religious addicts to the personal life and removing the customary law and replacing it, and giving customary law actually the statutory appearance of statutory law. And over the course of history, in the sense of development, there's only one. Now, Afghanistan is probably 100 years away from it, and there are many other countries, including Sudan, who are also quite far away from that stage where the three sets of laws could converge towards one law. And one can't foresee that happening in very near future. There is a World Bank initiative in Afghanistan on land ownership, but it is restricted to documenting the current ownership, period. Nothing more than that.
I'm really glad you separated the bodies of law. There's a great chapter by Siraj Said in a book called Land and Post-Conflict Peace Building. And he made that point that a lot of the critiques of, say, women's rights in Afghanistan or Somalia or other Islamic countries, the complaints, the critiques are really not about Islamic law. They're more about the customary law, and that the Islamic law tends to be more protective of women's rights to own land, to use resources, to access resources. But it's the application of the customary law that comes in. And so Islamic law is often an opportunity to advance women's rights. This is the argument he makes. And I should note that chapter is available on environmentalpeacebuilding.org. But I think that the coexistence of multiple bodies of law is something that we often see in many conflict-affected countries. Sometimes there's Islamic law, but usually there's customary law and statutory law, and then there may be religious law or martial law or other normative frameworks.
Yes, well, the Afghan society, like many tribal societies, is patrilineal and patronistic society. It favors male undoubtedly. The religious addicts are more balancing, but it also depends on who is interpreting on whose behalf. So it can also be misused. There is an additional complication, and I'll go to Sudan to point out to that, is that given the long-term needs for agricultural products in the Gulf area, there is pressure on Sudan to give its arable land, sell it or lease it to Middle Eastern countries, particularly the Gulf one. And large taxes have already been given. And in Darfur, this has created problem because communities, tribes have not been asked. They have just been asked to leave or forcibly evicted, and the land has been sold or given to lease. And you can see the evidence of that if you move to in the Darfur area with the signs and boards that are coming in. So one thing is that your right through tribal history to a particular land, whether it is written or not. But the other is that the state gets pressure from, because of its dependence on other states, to lease out the land and forcibly evict, and that creates further cause of tension in communities and sentiments against the center.
Asif, there's another question that was asked a little while ago. Rebel groups have the ability in some areas to switch between different natural resources to generate revenues as their access to one resource is curtailed. How can governments get ahead of and manage this? What impact does this switching have on non-combatants?
But this phenomena is quite common in long-standing conflicts, whether it is in Afghanistan or in Colombia or in Darfur or in South Sudan. And the best example that comes to my mind is in Afghanistan. Before Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, already the southern part of Afghanistan was unstable and producing large amounts of opium, which was converted into heroines in Afghanistan or in the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the market was glut with it. When the Taliban came to power and took Kabul, one of the early decisions made by them was to put a ban on growing of opium. And many of the people, analysts, thought that this was a great move. But the move, as we understood later on, was not to put a ban, but the move was to bring the prices of opium back to the original levels, because the market was not only glut with heroin, but it was also glut with opium stored both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So they stopped growing of opium for a few seasons. But it saw a new phenomena, that there was now a new income generating approach taking place in the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. One was, since no longer Afghanistan needed during Taliban times so much of arms and ammunition, so arms and ammunition was moving into Pakistan, smuggling, selling. The other was that kidnapping for ransom, bringing someone from Pakistan inside. So these were the ways to sustain the power of a group that was initially without power. Now it was with power, but it was still relying on the old resources. And this, you see, keeps changing in Afghanistan in a dynamic situation. So probably the key phenomena that we should note in this question is that rebel movements or insurgency have their own dynamic, and it keeps changing. It is not restricted to one natural resource. It keeps moving and sees the market around it, inside, outside, and rolls the insurgency with the best possible option available to it to make money, partly for themselves, partly to sustain the insurgency.
Another question from the students. In his lecture, David Jensen mentions that as countries are engaged in war, the environment drops down from the mainstream political agenda. The environment gets minimal attention, and in some sectors go beyond a tipping point. Can you give an example of what kinds of tipping points may be reached, and are there notable resources that are more likely or quicker to reach these tipping points?
Yes, David is absolutely right. When you enter a country like Sudan in 2007, 2006, after the peace agreement, comprehensive peace agreement is signed, and major agencies like FAO, UNDP, WFP enter Afghanistan after 2003, the range of challenges that you have are just enormous. And the traditional agencies like UNDP, FAO are tied up with areas that are necessary for the survival of the people. For instance, FAO would be tied up with food security rather than with forest and grazing areas. For a long period of time, FAO concentrated in Afghanistan, and currently it's doing in South Sudan. Most of its resources go into food security rather than into forestry sector or grazing land. The UNDP helps the government towards democratization, towards disarming of armed elements, and environment gets lower and lower in the agenda, even at the national level. In the cabinet, the weakest minister you will find will be the Minister of Environment, weakest possible. And if I can give example, I will not name the country, but in a country, the Environment Ministry has always gone to a party that is not the main party in power, but an allied party, small party, and the Environment Ministry goes to that party. For years, it has been going to that party, and the notion is that this is the best deal that we can have with a weak party. Weak ministry is just enough, and that party would have less influence in the cabinet. Other ministers will not support, and environment will suffer. The sector that I have seen suffer most in many parts where I have worked is the water sector, and one of the reasons why it suffers is that water is the responsibility of nearly half a dozen ministries everywhere, and in which Environment Ministry does not have any leverage. And countries like Afghanistan, areas like Darfur, survive through their water. These civilizations have been built on, for instance, in the case of Afghanistan, on 5 water basins. The entire civilization is based on that. If you do not take good care of that, you tip the balance. So in the example of tipping balance is the border area between Afghanistan and Iran, where there are few wetlands where River Helmand ends. The population on the Iranian side does not belong to the major sect. They are Sunnis, not Shias, Balochs. They have been traditionally anti-present regime. Availability of water in that area is absolutely essential to bind them to the land. And Iran badly needs water coming from Helmand River from Afghanistan to bind this population to the area and not let them move around to other parts of Iran where they cause more instability. And the balance has been tipped already because there is less water in Helmand River. There is not because of that Afghanistan is holding water, but it's climate change and partly cyclical. And the whole area is destabilized to the extent that Iran is no longer allowing Afghan migrants to that province, and it has moved part of the population away from that area. So the balance in that area, which is called Sistan, Balochistan, already tipped. And for a long period of time, until a major flood comes, which is generally a 10-year phenomena, no hope of getting that balance back.
Wondering, one of the students asked whether it's easier or faster to focus on the informal or formal economy to create natural resource livelihood options.
Yes, but the answer is that when a country is coming out of a long-term conflict, the formal economy is always small and informal economy is always large. And this is true of Afghanistan. I would not say same thing about Darfur, because Darfur or South Sudan have always remained part of the central economy. But in case of Afghanistan, the informal economy was large, is still large. Still, after so many years of democratic government there and international support, the informal economy is very large. And in the initial days, there is no choice except to work with the informal economy. And we worked like that right from the beginning through the informal sectors of the economy. I remember that in 2004, 2005, there was hardly any banking system to transfer funds from Kabul to the provinces. So we used to take bags full of dollars to provinces, and then informal economy came in, and you could do this hundi or hawala from Kabul. You will hand over money just on the basis of trust, and you will get the same money. Your colleague can get the same money in the provinces. The informal economy was working in that manner. It's only with the passage of time when the formal economy gains ground. But in situation of insurgency, which Afghanistan still have, there are many large and powerful actors in whose benefit it is to keep the large part of economy still informal. Otherwise, how will the insurgency remain there if you cannot bring in money from illicit activities that are going on in the area? So you export something out of the country and build houses or real estate in Kabul, and then the money grows in that. So you need that cycle of informal economy. Part of it goes into the insurgency, and part of it goes to the pockets of the leaders.
There's another question coming from regarding Afghanistan. The mine of Ainak has a consumption of water of around 540,000 cubic meters per day, and Kabul and Logan province face water scarcity. How to manage this grievance? And I don't know if that's current water usage or if it's projected.
Yes. So Logar province is neighboring Kabul on the eastern part of the country, bordering Pakistan, and it has the copper mine Ainak, which has been given to China on contract. The other mine, the Ainak mine, is in Central Highlands in Bamiyan, and an Indian contractor has got it. Both need heavy investment, long-term investment in terms of infrastructure, in terms of energy requirements, water requirements, and both provinces are already water scarce provinces. So the prospects of having them developed and contribute to Afghan economy in near and medium term future is nil. They will only increase water scarcity in both areas. Still, long-term solution is fine to secure new water resources. By the way, Afghanistan is not short of water resources. It barely stores 12% of its water. Rest of it either goes to the Central Asian states in the river Oxus, or it goes to Iran through Helmand River, excess of it, or it goes to Pakistan across Indus. The storage capacity, the hydraulic structures are very, very few in Afghanistan for it. It can have projects like Ainak and like the mine in Logar, but it needs a certain stability and certain infrastructure development before they can benefit. Again, I would repeat that it's the advantage of the companies to hold on their rights for the time being. Just that.
It seems that some of Afghanistan's neighbors are rather concerned about the fact that if Afghanistan does start developing its water resources, that may affect the water that flows across the border, whether it's the quality or quantity.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. All three Central Asian states, Pakistan and Iran are worried, and all three have different issues. With Pakistan, it's a bit more reciprocal arrangement because there is a river that goes from Pakistan to Afghanistan, and there's a river that comes from Afghanistan to Pakistan. They can have a dialogue, and later on agreement. It's the size of the problem is less, but the size of the problem is huge for Iran, where a whole province relies on water coming down the Helmand River. to the extent that the capital of the Iranian province of Sistan, Balochistan, Zahedan, which is few hundred kilometers from the border area, is supplied water from Helmand River. It's so much of dependence. Central Asian states would very much like to have the current state of affairs continuing. In fact, all neighbors would like the current state of affairs to continue because they can use the water, surplus water that is coming in for the unforeseen period till there is an agreement, or till the hydraulic structures come in, or till a negotiating settlement takes place. And it's very interesting that at a certain point in time, the Afghan president put a restriction on all Afghan ministries that no ministry can individually enter into an agreement or discussion with any neighboring country on water. They created a central council which has the right to, because there was suspicion that the influence of neighboring countries through certain ministry may result in legal agreements which the government may not have seen. So the central government has said everything will go through the Central Water Council. One. Two, they will not negotiate with any country till they have their own expertise available, which means human resources expertise. They say that Iran has 30 years of stability. They have data, they have experts. They can negotiate from a position of strength. We negotiate from a position of weakness. We will not negotiate now. We will negotiate when the time comes when we are as strong as them. And there are also other geostrategic political elements in terms of when these negotiations will take place. You need a strong central government in Afghanistan to enter into any such agreement to have the support of the people.
I'd like to close with a question on gender and conflict resources that was posed. What role does gender have in the discussion of conflict resources? Are men and women impacted equally?
Yeah, now this question, I don't have a common answer. It varies from country to country. Although both Afghanistan and, for instance, Sudan and South Sudan have tribal nature, but they differ in terms of their approach to gender. In Afghanistan, it's a no-go area for many developing agencies to even talk about that. It's only recently that it has opened up. Not all parts of the country are close to any discussion on gender roles. The Pashtun part, the dominant ethnic group, Pashtun group, is more conservative, and resist any idea on thinking about gender issues and integrating them into development. The northern part, which is closer to has been closer to Soviet Union and has seen their neighbors in a different light, and there is cultural exchange between them, is more open to that. The Central Highlands, which is the Shia minority of Afghanistan, is much more open to that. I have never attended in my 4.5 years any meeting in Pashtun areas where a single woman was present, but I have attended meetings in Central Highlands and Northern Afghanistan, meetings where women were present and they were debating. So not that it is very forward-looking in those areas as well, but they're different in cultural sense. There is more opening there. In case of the Arab versus African tribes, the African tribes are much more open. It's easy to work with them on these issues, more receptive to ideas, less so the pastoralists, the Arab Janjaweeds. South Sudan, very much open, but again, a society that looks where the gender relationship has been for hundreds of years in favor of men, as opposed to very difficult to work on gender issues. And you have to be careful on how you present, how you blend your views by not calling them in the language which you will be very comfortable in using in North America and Europe, but using the development language which is not political in the nature, in terms of the ownership of natural resources assets belonging to women, is a debate that is contentious.
And we've seen elsewhere, it does seem to depend on what the nature of the resource is. So in, say, example, Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you have a lot of artisanal mining that is part of the conflict economy, or has been, that women often do not have the same rights to mine the minerals. They often have lower paying jobs. They're exposed to sexual violence in ways that men are not. And so it does seem that, as you say, it depends on the country and on the resource.
Absolutely. But as a general rule, in countries like Afghanistan, Sudan, and South Sudan, the most onerous work in the agricultural system is done by women. And in such situations, the ownership of land or the income from the land is not something that is easily assimilated by the men-dominated society in those cultures. It comes with great difficulty.
Well, thank you so much, Asif. Any final words before we close the office hour?
My final line would be that I have not seen a post-conflict country where there hasn't been a hope. And despite the fact that things have not changed dramatically in Afghanistan since 2001, when you work with the people in that country, that gives you hope that change will come eventually. Same hope is given in Darfur by people. It's not politicians, it's not developing agencies, it's not banks, it's not international banks. It is the people that provide you with inspiration and people that provide you with hope that things will change. They may take time, they will change.
Very nice. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.